Nadia Celestine Broussard was 40 years old the February night she sat beside a dying man she had never met and held his hand until the morning came. And she told no one what she had done for 2 years after. She sold flowers from a stall at the farmer's market on 7th Street in Nashville every Saturday and Sunday. Irises and dahlias and seasonal cutting stems that she grew herself in the narrow side yard of her rental house on Fern Avenue, where she had installed raised beds along the fence line with salvaged lumber and topsoil she had hauled in herself 2 wheelbarrow loads at a time. She drove a van she had purchased second-hand for $800, and that she had kept running through a combination of YouTube tutorials and the mechanical stubbornness of a woman who understood that the alternative to fixing a problem yourself was paying someone else to fix it. And she could not always afford the alternative. She was, by all visible evidence, a woman who asked very little of the world and gave more than she kept. She had no idea the man she had sat with in room 14 of the Vanderbilt cardiac unit was the father of a man who had spent 2 years looking for her. She had no idea what that man had found out and what he intended to do with what he found. What happened on the 3rd Saturday of April at a flower stall on 7th Street would close a grief she had been carrying quietly for longer than she knew. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The early morning light of a Nashville April came in low and yellow through the market stall's canvas awning, and Nadia Broussard stood behind her buckets of stems and arranged the last of the irises with the attention she brought to every task she considered worth doing, which was every task she touched, without exception. Because her grandmother Celestine had told her once that how you did the small things was how you did all things, and she had been young enough when she heard it to absorb it into the grain of who she was, rather than file it as advice she intended to follow eventually. She kept the stall the way she kept the side yard, orderly, intentional, every stem trimmed to the same length in each bucket. The color arrangements considered rather than random, a small hand-lettered sign that listed the names of each variety in her particular looping cursive. Customers came back for the flowers, but they also came back, she suspected, because the stall felt like a place where attention had been paid, and people responded to that even when they could not name it. Grandmother Celestine had raised her in a house in Baton Rouge with a kitchen garden that was the envy of the neighborhood and a standard of conduct that had no patience for half measures. She had been a woman of few words and exact ones, and the exact one she had repeated most often was, "Nadia, your hands are the most honest part of you. What you do with them tells the truth about who you are." Celestine had died of pneumonia 3 years ago, at 81, having outlasted 2 husbands and a generation of people who had underestimated her, and Nadia had sat at her bedside the last 36 hours and held her hand and talked to her and sang the hymns she knew until the room went still, and had driven home afterward in a particular kind of silence that was not the same as emptiness but was its own specific geography of loss. She had known how to sit with dying people before the night in room 14. That was one of the things about Nadia Broussard that her customers did not know, and that the man in February had not asked about. She also kept a second-hand book on soil chemistry that she had read 3 times and marked with paper tabs, a weather journal she had been filling since she started the side yard beds, and a small savings account at the credit union on Gallatin Avenue that she added to every month in amounts that varied, but never zero. The savings account held $6,400. It had taken 4 years. She checked the balance monthly and said nothing about it to anyone, not because she was ashamed of the number, but because she had grown up in a house where money was discussed in the voice you used for things that required handling with care, and she had not lost that instinct. She had been a hospital unit secretary at Vanderbilt for 11 years before she left to grow flowers full-time. And she had been good at the work in the specific way that people are good at work that suits their temperament. Organized, steady, fluent in the grammar of institutions, able to hold a dozen things in her attention at once, without losing the thread of any of them. She had left not because the work was wrong, but because the side yard had grown into something that wanted to be bigger. And she had done the arithmetic on a legal pad one evening and decided that the arithmetic was close enough to viable, that she owed the thing an honest attempt. Those 11 years had taught her things that could not be learned any other way. She had learned the specific texture of a waiting room at 2 a.m. and how to read what a family needed from the way they were sitting. She had learned that the most important thing you could give a frightened person was not information, but company. The plain animal comfort of another body in the room that was not in a hurry to be somewhere else. She had learned that hospitals, for all their clinical machinery, were places where human beings arrived at the most naked versions of themselves, stripped of performance and pretense, and reduced to what they actually were. And that what they actually were was almost always better than the version they showed the world in ordinary daylight. She had found that beautiful, in a quiet way. She had carried it with her out of the building on her last day, and into the side yard on Fern Avenue, and into every Saturday morning at the market stall. And it was the thing that made her flowers feel different to the people who bought them, even the ones who could not say why. The detail about her hospital years was the one that mattered. That was the thread that ran backward to February and forward to April and made the distance between them navigable. On the night of February 17th, she had been at Vanderbilt, not for work, but for an appointment of her own, a follow-up she had been rescheduling for 4 months and had finally kept because Celestine's voice in her memory had grown insistent on the subject of self-neglect. The appointment had run late, as all things ran late in hospitals, and it had been past 9 when she came out of the elevator on the first floor and found a man sitting alone in the corridor outside the cardiac unit's family consultation room with the specific stillness of a person who had received news and had not yet decided what to do with it. He was somewhere in his late 70s. He was wearing a good coat that he had not removed, which told her something. He was holding a hat in his hands and turning it slowly, which told her something else. She stopped. She should have kept walking. Her car was in the garage 2 buildings over, and it was February, and the temperature had dropped since she came in. She stopped anyway. She said, "Can I get you anything? Water? Or coffee from the machine?" He looked up. His eyes were the color of creek water, and they had the quality of a man who had seen a long distance of life and was not surprised by much, but was, right now, very tired. He said, "They say he won't see morning." She sat down beside him. She did not ask who. She did not offer the kinds of statements that people offer in hospital corridors that are shaped like comfort and feel like cardboard. She simply sat. His name was Walter. The man in room 14 was his brother, Raymond, and they had not spoken in 11 years over a dispute that Walter could now not reconstruct with enough precision to explain why it had been allowed to last that long. And Raymond had been found collapsed at his home 3 days ago by a neighbor who had a spare key. And the doctors had said that the heart damage was beyond repair, and Walter had flown from Atlanta that morning and sat in this corridor for 9 hours waiting for something he did not have words for. She listened. She did not look at the clock. At 11:30, a nurse came out and said that Raymond was asking for someone to be with him, that he was conscious and that the night would be difficult and it would help to not be alone. And Walter looked at Nadia with the helpless expression of a man who had come prepared for grief, but not for the specific requirement of presence. And she understood what was being asked of her in the same way she had understood it at Celestine's bedside, not as a burden, but as a clear and answerable question. She said, "I'll go in." You rest." She went in. She stayed until 4:17 in the morning, when Raymond Alston Grantley took his last breath with someone holding his hand. And she walked out into the pre-dawn corridor and found Walter asleep in the chair with his coat still on, and she sat across from him and waited for him to wake. And when he did, she told him simply and without elaboration that his brother had passed quietly and that he had not been alone. Walter's face did something in that moment that she looked away from, because some things were not for witnesses. He reached for her hand and held it for a moment and said, "I don't even know your name." She told him her name. She said she was sorry for his loss. She picked up her bag and she walked to the elevator, and she drove home in the particular February dark. And she did not tell anyone what had happened, not because it was a secret, but because it was complete the way some things are complete, the way a finished piece of work is complete, the way a well-planted bed is complete, and adding words to it would only diminish it. She thought about it occasionally in the months that followed. She thought about Walter and his coat and his hat in his hands, and whether he had been able to say what he needed to Raymond before the end, and whether the ending had been, given the circumstances, as decent as an ending could be. She hoped it had been. She grew her flowers. She tended her beds. She weighed the soil chemistry and watched the weather and trimmed the stems and drove to the market every Saturday and Sunday and arranged the irises in their buckets and let the work be its own sufficient reason for the work. She did not think about the man in room 14 having a son. She had never asked. His name was Devion Grantley. He was 44 years old, and he operated a private investment firm out of Atlanta that his father Raymond had built over 35 years, and that Devion had quietly grown in the decades since taking control of it, from a mid-tier regional operation into a firm with $280 million in assets under management, and a reputation for taking positions that other firms found too patient and too quiet. And that consistently proved out over time. He had been in Singapore when his father died. He had learned of it from a phone call from his uncle Walter, and he had come home to find his father gone, and his uncle sitting in the kitchen of Raymond's house with a cup of cold coffee and the name of a woman written on a piece of paper, torn from a hospital notepad. Walter had said, "She was there when I could not be. She sat with him, and she held his hand, and she told me he was not alone." I do not know how to account for that, Devion. I do not know how to account for it, except to say that some people are built differently from the rest of us, and I think your father had the good fortune to meet one at the end. Devion had taken the piece of paper. He had kept it. For 2 years he had kept it, not out of inaction, but out of a deliberateness that had defined everything he had ever done. His father had built the firm on a single principle that Devion had watched him practice across 3 decades and had absorbed so thoroughly that it had become his own, that the value of a gesture was inseparable from the seriousness with which it was made, and that the right moment was worth more than the fast one. Raymond Grantley had taught his son to wait for the right structure before moving, to assemble the full picture before committing, to refuse the impulse that looked like decisiveness and was actually impatience dressed up in urgent clothing. He was not a man who moved on feeling. He was a man who moved on clarity. He had spent those 2 years building that clarity. He had engaged a colleague in Nashville, a woman named Diane, who handled community relations for a non-profit Devion's firm supported, and asked her to make quiet inquiries. Not surveillance, not investigation, but the kind of careful attentiveness that allowed a picture to form without disturbing the subject of it. Diane had found the market stall through the city's vendor license records. She had found the side yard on Fern Avenue through a neighbor who had mentioned in a community garden forum that a woman on that block grew dahlias that were doing extraordinary things. She had found the Vanderbilt years through the clinic's public acknowledgement archive, which had named Nadia in a staff recognition from 3 years prior. She had found the credit union savings account listed in a community financial wellness story in a local newsletter, anonymized but traceable by someone who knew what to look for. What Diane had assembled was not a dossier. It was a portrait, and the portrait was consistent in every detail with the woman Walter had described at the kitchen table with the cold coffee. A person of complete and unperformed integrity, who did the right thing when no one was watching and nothing was owed, and who had not told anyone about it for 2 years, which Devian considered the most telling fact of all. He had asked Diane, "Does she seem like a person who would be made uncomfortable by gratitude?" Diane had thought about it and said, "I think she's a person who would receive it correctly. She'd probably ask if you wanted flowers." He had arrived at the market on a Saturday morning in April. He arrived at the market on the 3rd Saturday of April at 8:15 in the morning, before the crowd thickened, wearing clothes that fit him well, but did not announce themselves. And he walked the length of 7th Street until he found the stall with the hand-lettered sign and the irises in their buckets arranged by color, and the woman behind them trimming the ends of a bundle of dahlias with the focused quiet of someone who was exactly where she intended to be. He stood at the edge of the stall for a moment. She looked up. He said, "Are you Nadia Broussard?" She said she was. He said, "My name is Devian Grantley. My father was Raymond. He passed on the 17th of February, 2 years ago at Vanderbilt Medical Center." He paused. "I understand you were with him." Nadia set down the dahlias. The morning moved around them, vendors and early customers, and the particular sound of a market waking up, and they stood in the still center of it. 2 people for whom this moment had been a long time arriving. She said, "He wasn't alone." He said, "I know. My uncle told me. He told me what you did, and he told me that he has spent 2 years trying to find the right language for what it meant, and he is 81 years old and has not found it yet." He said, "I'm not sure I have either. But I came to say it in whatever language I have." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "How is your Uncle Walter?" The question surprised him. He was quiet for a beat, and then something in him settled, because the question was entirely consistent with the picture of her that he had been holding for 2 years, and entirely consistent with what she had done in that hospital corridor. And it confirmed that he had found the right person, and that the right person was exactly who his uncle had said she was. He said, "He's well. He asks about you. I told him I was coming today." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed an envelope. He set it on the edge of the stall's display board, beside the hand-lettered sign. He said she was under no obligation, and she should take her time. The envelope contained a letter from the Grantley Family Foundation, established by Raymond in 1998 and administered now by Devian, which made a charitable grant in the amount of $60,000 to a recipient of the foundation's choosing each year in Raymond's name. The letter stated that the board had voted, unanimously, Devian's 1 vote and his Uncle Walter's making the full board, to designate the current year's grant to Nadia Celestine Broussard of Nashville, Tennessee, for purposes she herself chose to define, in recognition of a service that the foundation considered irreducible in value, and therefore best honored with the freedom of an unconditioned gift. There was a handwritten note beneath the letter. It said, "He was not alone because you chose to stop. There is no currency for that. This is only an acknowledgement. Your name is in our family now, and it will stay there." With gratitude across all of us, Walter, Nadia read both documents with the same stillness she brought to things that required her full attention. She did not perform surprise. She did not make the sounds people make when they need a room to understand how they are receiving something. She read the letter, and she read the note, and she set them carefully back in the envelope. She said, "I didn't do it for this." Devion said, "I know that. That's the whole reason." She looked at him for a moment, in the way she looked at things she was deciding whether to trust, not with suspicion, but with the particular careful attention of a woman who had learned that generosity deserved as much scrutiny as its opposite. She said, "Would you like some flowers?" "For your uncle." He said he would. She chose them herself, white irises, which she cut fresh, and a handful of sweet william that she wrapped in brown paper and tied with the same twine she used for everything. She told him that irises were one of the few flowers that meant something across every culture she had read about, that they carried a meaning of faith and hope and the kind of courage that was not loud, and that she thought an 81-year-old man who had sat in a hospital corridor for 9 hours in his coat deserved all three. He took the flowers and paid for them, and she would not accept more than the listed price, and he did not argue, because he was a man who had learned, from watching his father, and from the 2 years he had spent building a portrait of this woman, from the shape of her life, that some things were worth accepting on exactly the terms offered. 14 months later, on a Saturday in early June, the side yard on Fern Avenue had expanded. Nadia had purchased the narrow lot adjacent to her rental house. The grant had become the down payment, combined with 4 years of the credit union savings, on a property transaction that her real estate attorney, a crisp and unflappable woman named Philippa, had described as the cleanest small lot acquisition she had processed in a decade. The new lot added 60 feet of growing space along its southern fence, which Nadia had already fitted with raised beds in the same salvaged lumber style, already planted, already productive. The van had been replaced, not with anything expensive, but with something reliable and properly sized for the volume she was now moving, because the grant had also allowed her to add a second market day midweek, and to supply 3 restaurant accounts that had been waiting for a producer with her consistency and her range. The hand-lettered sign had been reprinted on better stock. Devion Grantley had been to the stall 4 times since April. The first time, he had brought a card from Walter. The second time, he had come alone and asked about the dahlia varieties and stayed long enough to buy 3 bundles and to have a conversation about soil drainage that had lasted 20 minutes and that Nadia had found, to her own surprise, entirely absorbing. The third time, he had asked if she would have coffee after the market closed. She had said yes. The fourth time, they had walked the Shelby Bottoms Greenway in the late afternoon and talked about their fathers and what it meant to carry something forward that the person who built it could no longer see. He was a man who moved slowly and meant what he said. She was a woman who asked good questions and sat in silence, without discomfort. These were, it turned out, compatible qualities in the particular way that made a Saturday afternoon in June feel like something that had been correctly built. Walter had told Devion, on a phone call in March, that he thought his brother Raymond would have liked her. He had said it the way he said things, plainly, without embellishment, with the authority of a man who had been right about most things that mattered and knew it. Devion had said he thought so too. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. And on a Saturday morning in early June, the irises in their buckets caught the first light of the day, and the stall smelled of cut stems and damp paper, and the kind of morning that arrives on its own timetable and cannot be hurried, and Nadia Celestine Broussard wrapped a bundle of dahlias for the first customer of the day, and did not look up to see who was watching, because she had never needed an audience for the work. She had only ever needed the work. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.